3 weeks ago, on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning in Washington, a decision was finalized that would shake the foundations of global trade. The document was simple, barely 3 pages, stamped with the presidential seal, but its contents carried the weight of the empire. New tariffs targeting African exports, effective immediately. 15% on textiles, 20% of processed cocoa, additional levies on gold, cotton, and agricultural products. The numbers were precise, calculated to hurt without destroying, to pressure without triggering a humanitarian crisis. It was economic surgery performed with a blunt instrument, designed to remind Africa of its place in the global hierarchy. In the State Department, analysts had wargamed every scenario. They predicted protests, certainly, diplomatic complaints, inevitably, but ultimately, compliance. After all, African nations needed access to American markets worth over $45 billion annually. The calculation was simple. No country would risk that revenue stream over principles. History had proven this formula countless times before. But 3,000 miles away, in a modest office in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, a different calculation was being made. Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old president who had risen from military ranks to national leadership, sat reading the same document. His advisors filled the room with nervous energy, some arguing for negotiation, others for careful diplomatic protest. The Minister of Trade was already calculating potential losses: $600 million in annual exports, thousands of jobs, entire communities dependent on cotton and gold sales. The Western media had already written their narrative. Traoré was young, inexperienced, a transitional figure in a country known more for its poverty than its power. Burkina Faso's entire GDP barely matched the annual revenue of a mid-sized American corporation. Surely, this former soldier would understand the mathematics of power. Surely, he would choose pragmatism over pride. They had studied everything about him, except what mattered most. They knew his military record, his age, his political alliances, but they had not understood the weight of history he carried. The memories of generations who had watched their gold leave African soil only to return as expensive jewelry, their cotton transformed into designer clothing they could never afford. They had not calculated the cost of dignity repeatedly deferred, sovereignty perpetually postponed. As news of the tariffs spread across African capitals in early September, a familiar ritual began. Emergency meetings were called. Finance ministers recalculated budgets. Presidents prepared carefully worded statements, expressing concern while avoiding confrontation. In Accra, Nairobi, and Pretoria, the response was predictable. Diplomatic protest coupled with private acceptance. The machine of global trade would continue turning, with Africa bearing the cost as it always had. But this time, something was different. In the streets of Ouagadougou, young people gathered not in protest but in anticipation. They had seen their president expel foreign military bases, nationalize gold mines, and redirect agricultural policy toward food sovereignty. They sensed that this moment demanded something more than diplomatic letters and private negotiations. They waited for a signal that would either confirm their hopes or crush them entirely. The international markets barely noticed at first. African commodities represented a fraction of global trade, easily replaced, readily substituted. Wall Street algorithms adjusted prices by decimal points. London metal exchanges noted minor fluctuations. In Beijing and Moscow, strategists observed with mild interest, seeing opportunity perhaps, but not revolution. Yet in that modest office in Ouagadougou, as the sun reached its zenith over the Sahel that September afternoon, Ibrahim Traoré made a decision that would ripple across continents. He would not negotiate, he would not protest, he would not accept. Instead, he would speak a truth that had been swallowed for too long, words that would transform tariffs from weapons of control into catalysts of liberation. The old weapon had returned, but this time, it would meet something unexpected, a generation that had finally grown tired of kneeling. The emergency session convened at sunset that same day. Ministers, advisors, and military commanders filled the presidential conference room, their faces reflecting the gravity of the moment. On the wall, a map of Africa seemed to watch over their deliberations, its borders drawn by foreign hands, its resources flowing along routes established by colonial powers. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The Minister of Finance spoke first, his voice steady but strained. "Mr. President, we must consider the numbers. 600 million in lost revenue, 20,000 jobs directly affected, supply chains that took decades to build." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Perhaps we could negotiate a gradual implementation, seek exemptions for certain products." Others echoed similar sentiments. The path of least resistance had been walked so many times it had become a highway. Comply, adjust, survive. It was the mathematics of the powerless, the accounting of those who had learned to measure sovereignty in percentage points and dignity in exchange rates. Traoré listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. He had heard these arguments before, not just in this room but throughout African history. Always the same calculus. Accept small humiliations to avoid larger catastrophes. Always the same conclusion. Tomorrow we will be stronger. Today we must survive. When the last advisor finished speaking, silence filled the room. Traoré stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the city below. Ouagadougou was lighting up for the evening, its streets alive with the energy of people who had known struggle intimately, who had built lives from dust and determination. "Tell me," he said quietly, his back still to the room, "when our gold leaves Burkina Faso at $60 per gram and returns as jewelry at $200, who benefits? When our cotton is exported raw and returns as clothing we cannot afford, who profits? When our young people risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean because they see no future here, who wins?" He turned to face them, and in his eyes was something that made even the generals straighten in their seats. "For 60 years, we have been independent on paper, but dependent on practice. We have had presidents, but not sovereignty, flags, but not freedom. Every time we accept their terms, we mortgage our children's future for our present comfort." The Minister of Trade interjected, "But Mr. President, the Americans expect." "I know what they expect," Traoré cut him off. "They expect us to calculate, to compromise, to accept. They expect us to be reasonable, responsible, and realistic. They expect us to be everything except free." He moved to the head of the table, his presence filling the room. "Gentlemen, we stand at a crossroads. We can choose the familiar path of negotiation and gradual concession, or we can choose something else. Something our ancestors dreamed of but never saw. Something our children deserve but will never receive if we continue to genuflect before economic threats." The next morning, September 6th, international media gathered for what they assumed would be a standard diplomatic response. Camera crews from CNN, BBC, and France 24 adjusted their equipment, expecting carefully crafted statements about concern and dialogue. The press room was full but not overcrowded. After all, this was Burkina Faso responding to American trade policy, hardly headline material. Traoré entered without fanfare, without the usual entourage of advisors. He approached the podium with the bearing of a soldier reporting for duty, not a politician performing for cameras. When he spoke, his voice carried across the room with unusual clarity. Yesterday, the United States announced new tariffs on African exports. These measures target not luxuries but necessities. The gold that builds our hospitals, the cotton that feeds our families, the agricultural products that sustain our communities. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. For decades, Africa has been told that access to Western markets is a privilege we must earn through compliance, that our development depends on their approval, that our sovereignty has limits defined by their interests. The room grew quieter, journalists leaning forward, sensing something beyond routine diplomacy. Today, Burkina Faso says no. Today, West Africa says no. Today, Africa says no. His voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in conviction. "We reject these tariffs not because we cannot pay them, but because we refuse to accept the premise that our trade, our resources, and our future must be negotiated on terms dictated by others." Then came the 9 words that would echo across continents, shared in screenshots, painted on walls, chanted in protests. "Africa is done kneeling. Our sovereignty is not negotiable." The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, Even the camera operators forgot to adjust their focus. Then, like a dam breaking, questions erupted from every corner. But Traoré had already turned and walked out, leaving behind a press room in chaos and a world struggling to process what had just happened. Within minutes, the video was viral. #AfricaIsNotKneeling began trending globally. In Lagos, students poured into the streets carrying hastily made signs. In Johannesburg, taxi drivers honked their horns in solidarity. In Dakar, market women ululated in celebration. But in Washington, the response was bewilderment, turning to anger. How dare a country with a GDP smaller than the annual budget of the Pentagon reject American trade policy? How dare a leader barely known outside Africa challenge the global economic order? The phone lines between Washington and other African capitals burned with activity. Surely, American diplomats reasoned, other African leaders would distance themselves from Traoré's statement. Surely, economic reality would reassert itself. But something had shifted. The 9 words had become 9 cracks in a dam that had held for too long. And once a dam begins to crack, no amount of pressure can stop the flood that follows. The first 72 hours after Traoré's declaration would later be studied in international relations courses as a masterclass in rapid, diplomatic realignment. What Washington had calculated as an isolated act of defiance became a continental awakening, and what began as bilateral trade pressure transformed into a global reconfiguration of power. It started with Mali. President Assimi Goïta, watching from Bamako, recognized the moment for what it was: an opportunity to break the cycle of dependency that had trapped the Sahel for generations. Within 6 hours of Traoré's statement, Mali announced its full support, adding its own rejection of what Goïta called economic colonialism disguised as trade policy. Niger followed within 12 hours. Then Guinea. Then Chad. By the end of the first day, 15 African nations had issued statements of solidarity. By the end of the second day, that number had doubled. By the 72nd hour, 34 African countries had formed what would become known as the Continental Trade Defense Alliance. But the real shock came from beyond Africa's borders. In Beijing, an emergency meeting of the State Council convened at midnight on September 7th. China's strategists recognized an opportunity that transcended mere commerce. Within 48 hours, Beijing announced an immediate expansion of its African mineral purchase program, offering to buy gold, cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements at premium prices, with payments in yuan that bypassed the dollar entirely. The numbers were staggering. $20 billion in immediate purchase agreements. Currency swap lines totaling $30 billion more. Technology transfer agreements that would have taken years to negotiate were signed in days. But most significantly, China offered something Washington could not: respect for African sovereignty without political conditions. Moscow's response was equally swift, but more targeted. President Putin, understanding the symbolic power of gold in this confrontation, announced that Russia would purchase African gold reserves directly at 5% above market rates. Furthermore, Russia offered security cooperation packages that included air defense systems, transport aircraft, and training programs, all available through barter agreements that required no hard currency. The message was clear: Africa could defend its sovereignty, both economically and militarily, without Western approval or assistance. India entered the arena with a different approach. New Delhi announced long-term agricultural purchase agreements worth $15 billion annually, focusing on cotton, cashew nuts, and food grains. In return, India offered its pharmaceutical industry's output at cost, potentially saving African nations billions in healthcare expenses. For a continent where medication costs could bankrupt families, this was not just economics but survival. Brazil, remembering its own history of economic subjugation, returned to Africa with agricultural cooperation agreements that prioritized technology transfer and joint ventures rather than simple trade. São Paulo's commodity exchanges began listing African agricultural futures, creating alternative price discovery mechanisms that weakened Chicago and London's monopolistic control. But perhaps the most surprising response came from an unexpected quarter: Europe. While Brussels officially maintained its alignment with Washington, European corporations began quietly increasing their African imports. German manufacturers needed African raw materials, French luxury brands depended on African cotton and leather. Italian food processors required African agricultural products. The European Central Bank, without fanfare, began accepting African sovereign bonds as collateral, providing a crucial liquidity lifeline. The contradiction was stark. While European politicians spoke of solidarity with American trade policy, European businesses voted with their purchase orders. Within weeks, African exports to Europe increased by 12%, more than offsetting any potential American market loss. In Ouagadougou, Traoré watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and caution. In a televised address to the nation on September 10th, he articulated what was happening with characteristic clarity. "We are not replacing one master with another. We are not trading Western chains for Eastern ones. What we are building is something new. A multipolar shield that protects African sovereignty through diversified partnerships based on mutual benefit, not hierarchical control." The economic data supported his vision. Within just 2 weeks, African nations had secured $45 billion in new trade agreements, currency swaps, and investment commitments. The threatened $600 million in tariff losses had become almost trivial against this wave of alternative arrangements. But the numbers only told part of the story. Something psychological had shifted. The fear that had paralyzed African decision-making for decades was evaporating. If Burkina Faso could survive American pressure, if 34 nations could coordinate response in 72 hours, if alternative partners could provide better terms than traditional powers, then what else was possible? In Washington, emergency meetings produced no solutions, only recriminations. The State Department had wargamed many scenarios, but not this one. They had prepared for individual defiance, not continental unity. They had expected negotiation, not rejection. They had calculated that fear of isolation would triumph over dreams of sovereignty. The intelligence community's assessment was blunt. We have lost control of the narrative. Tariffs, our traditional tool of economic coercion, have become a catalyst for the very independence we sought to prevent. Wall Street's reaction was equally telling. Commodity prices gyrated wildly as traders struggled to price in a world where African resources flowed through multiple channels rather than traditional Western-controlled routes. Cocoa futures in New York climbed 7%. Cotton indices in Chicago became volatile. Gold contracts spiked as investors realized that African gold might no longer automatically flow through London and Zurich. But the most profound impact was on the streets of Africa. In Lagos, young entrepreneurs spoke of new possibilities, of trading with Asia and Latin America without seeking Western approval. In Nairobi, technology workers celebrated the potential for African innovation to find global markets through multiple channels. In Johannesburg, university students debated not whether Africa could be independent, but how quickly it could happen. The multipolar shield was more than economic architecture. It was psychological liberation. For the first time in centuries, Africa had options, real options, not just theoretical alternatives, but actual partners, willing to engage in terms of mutual respect. As one Senegalese economist noted on social media, garnering millions of views, "They threatened us with tariffs. We responded with options. They offered us chains. We built bridges. They expected surrender. They received sovereignty." The old unipolar world, where a single power could dictate terms to entire continents, had not ended. But it had cracked, and through those cracks, a different future was becoming visible. The ripples from Ouagadougou spread far beyond Africa's borders, reaching corporate boardrooms, university campuses, and government offices across the globe. What had started as a trade dispute between Washington and a landlocked African nation had evolved into a fundamental questioning of the global economic order. In Abuja, Nigeria's leadership found itself at a crossroads. For years, Africa's largest economy had carefully balanced its relationships, maintaining ties with the West while exploring opportunities with the East. But Traoré's defiance had changed the calculus. Nigerian economists presented a stark analysis to President Tinubu. The nation was spending $6 billion annually, importing refined petroleum while exporting crude oil under contracts that hadn't been substantially revised in decades. If Burkina Faso can renegotiate its position in global trade, the finance minister argued last week, What excuse does Nigeria have for continuing arrangements that impoverish our people while enriching foreign refineries? Within days, Nigeria announced a comprehensive review of all international oil contracts, suggesting that future exports would prioritize nations offering technology transfer for domestic refining capacity. The implications were seismic. Nigeria's oil represented nearly 2 million barrels per day. Any significant shift in its trading patterns would reshape global energy markets. South Africa watched with equal intensity. As a BRICS member, Pretoria had long straddled two worlds, maintaining deep ties with Western financial markets while building relationships with emerging powers. The success of the Continental Trade Defence Alliance presented an opportunity and a challenge. South African mining companies, historically aligned with London and New York financial markets, began exploring listing on Shanghai and Mumbai exchanges. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange, Africa's largest, announced new rules facilitating intra-African investment flows just yesterday. The rand, long vulnerable to Western market sentiment, began stabilizing as trade with China, India, and Brazil provided alternative foreign exchange sources. University students in Cape Town and Johannesburg painted murals of Traoré with the caption, "Courage is contagious," while business schools added case studies on the Ouagadougou model to their curricula. Kenya's response was perhaps most pragmatic. As East Africa's commercial hub, Nairobi had always prided itself on diplomatic flexibility. But the numbers were compelling. Kenyan tea and coffee, long sold through London auctions that captured most value-added profits, could potentially find better prices in direct sales to Asian markets. Horticultural products, subjected to stringent and often arbitrary European standards, might find more appreciative markets in the Middle East and Asia. The Central Bank of Kenya published a remarkable report just this morning, showing that redirecting just 20% of exports from traditional Western markets to new partners could increase foreign exchange earnings by 50%. The report's conclusion was diplomatic but clear. Economic sovereignty requires diversified partnerships. Recent developments demonstrate that such diversification is not only possible but profitable. The domino effect was not limited to Africa. Across the Atlantic, Latin American nations observed with keen interest. Mexico, scarred by previous tariff battles with Washington, recognized the template Burkina Faso had created. Brazilian economists wrote extensively about the Traoré doctrine, the idea that economic sovereignty was achievable through multipolar partnerships rather than bilateral dependence. In Southeast Asia, nations long caught between American and Chinese influence saw a third path. Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia began discussing their own regional trade defense mechanisms. If Africa could coordinate 34 nations in 72 hours, what could ASEAN achieve with its established institutional framework? The academic world buzzed with analysis. Harvard's Kennedy School hosted emergency seminars on the end of economic coercion. The London School of Economics published papers on multipolarity and trade sovereignty. The University of Cape Town launched a new program in South-South economic cooperation. But perhaps the most telling response came from an unexpected source: American corporations. Quietly, without press releases or public statements, major U.S. companies began establishing subsidiaries in Dubai, Singapore, and Mauritius, creating legal structures that would allow them to continue African trade regardless of tariff policies. The Business Roundtable, representing America's largest corporations, privately lobbied Washington to reconsider its approach. A leaked memo from a Fortune 500 CEO captured the corporate anxiety. We are watching the emergence of parallel trading systems that exclude American businesses. Tariffs intended to maintain our leverage are instead accelerating our irrelevance. Wall Street's response was schizophrenic. Public analysts maintained that American market access remained crucial for developing nations. Private trading desks were rapidly building expertise in yuan-denominated instruments, rupee trade finance, and real-based commodity contracts. The dollar's dominance was not ending, but its monopoly was. The psychological shift was even more profound than the economic realignment. Across Africa, a generation that had grown up being told that Western partnership was the only path to development was witnessing alternative possibilities unfold in real time. Social media exploded with discussions, memes, and debates. The hashtag number sovereignty is possible trended for weeks. In Ouagadougou, Traoré received a stream of visitors: presidents, prime ministers, business leaders, youth activists. They came not seeking aid or making requests, but offering partnership and solidarity. The small landlocked nation had become a symbol of possibility, proof that David could not only stand up to Goliath, but could rally other Davids to stand together. An elderly Ghanaian economist, speaking at a conference in Accra 2 days ago, captured the moment perfectly. For my entire career, I taught that Africa had to accept its place in the global value chain. I taught that we had to be patient, to develop slowly, to accept terms offered by those with power. Traoré has proven that everything I taught was wrong, and I have never been happier to be wrong. The dominoes were still falling, each impact creating new patterns, new possibilities, new futures. The fear that had once defined global economic relations was dissolving, replaced by something more powerful: imagination. Part 5. Dawn of Sovereignty. As I write this today, September 26, 2025, the landscape of global trade has fundamentally transformed in just 3 weeks. What began as an American attempt to discipline African trade has instead catalyzed the most significant shift in international economic relations since the end of colonialism. The old tools of control, tariffs, sanctions, market access, have not merely failed, they have backfired spectacularly. In Washington, a classified State Department review acknowledged what public officials could not. The unipolar moment in economic affairs has ended. Our traditional instruments of influence have become catalysts for the very independence we sought to prevent. The Traoré Doctrine has proven that economic sovereignty is achievable through coordinated multilateral resistance. But this was not merely about the failure of American policy or the success of African resistance. Something more fundamental had occurred. The invisible chains that had bound nations into accepting subordinate positions in the global economy had been revealed as psychological rather than material. Once that psychology shifted, once fear was replaced by possibility, the entire architecture of dependency began to crumble. The numbers tell only part of the story, but they are nonetheless remarkable. In just 3 weeks, African trade with non-Western partners has increased by 12%. Intra-African trade, long stifled by colonial-era infrastructure and Western-oriented financial systems, has grown by 8%. Currency swap arrangements totaling $90 billion have reduced dollar dependency across the continent. Yet the human impact is even more profound. In villages across Burkina Faso, farmers who had once accepted whatever prices international markets offered are now part of cooperatives negotiating directly with buyers in India and China. Young engineers, who might have sought opportunities in Europe, are building processing facilities in their home countries. The brain drain that had weakened Africa for generations is beginning to reverse. Traoré, in a speech yesterday marking 3 weeks since his famous declaration, reflected on what has been achieved. We did not win a war against anyone. We won a peace for ourselves. We did not defeat our partners. We discovered our power. We did not close our doors to the world. We opened multiple doors that had been hidden from us. The transformation extends beyond economics into the realm of consciousness. African children are growing up in a world where their continent is not perpetually seeking assistance, but actively choosing partners, where their leaders speak not of catching up, but of creating different paths, where their resources are not curses to be managed, but assets to be leveraged. The impact on global youth is equally significant. In universities from Sao Paulo to Mumbai, from Cairo to Jakarta, students are studying what they call the Ouagadougou moment, the instant when a single leader's defiance revealed that the emperor of economic coercion had no clothes. Movements are emerging, advocating for similar sovereignty in their own nations, questioning why their countries accept terms they have the power to reject. Even in the United States, a new generation is questioning the wisdom of economic coercion. Young economists at MIT and Stanford are publishing papers showing that collaborative trade produces better outcomes than coercive tariffs. Business schools are teaching courses on post-hegemonic commerce. The Council on Foreign Relations is hosting debates on America's role in a multipolar economy. The lesson is clear but difficult for established powers to accept. Genuine partnership based on mutual benefit is more stable and profitable than hierarchical relationships maintained through threat and pressure. The multipolar world is not just fairer, it is more efficient, more innovative, more dynamic. Historians are already marking Traoré's 9 words as a turning point, not just for Africa, but for the entire global order. Africa is done. Kneeling has become more than a slogan. It has become a philosophy, a declaration that dignity and development are not mutually exclusive, that sovereignty and prosperity can walk hand in hand. The old world, built on assumptions of permanent hierarchy and inevitable dependency, has not disappeared overnight. But its foundations have cracked irreparably. Through those cracks grows something new. A world where a farmer in Burkina Faso can negotiate with a manufacturer in Bangladesh, where a programmer in Nigeria can partner with an investor in Brazil, where economic relations are determined by mutual benefit rather than historical dominance. In his reflection yesterday, Traoré spoke words that will echo through history. Our ancestors were forced to kneel, but they never taught us how. They knew that one day we would stand. That day has come, not just for Burkina Faso, not just for Africa, but for every nation and every people who have been told that their dreams must wait for someone else's permission. The sun that rises this morning illuminates a different world. Not perfect, not without challenges, but fundamentally changed. The age of economic empire is ending. The dawn of economic sovereignty has begun. And in classrooms, boardrooms, and family dinners across the globe, people are asking themselves a simple but revolutionary question. If Burkina Faso could transform tariffs from weapons into opportunities, if Africa could turn economic pressure into continental unity, if the global South could create alternatives to northern dominance, then what else is possible? History is being written right now, and for the first time in centuries, Africa is holding the pen. The story is far from over, but its trajectory has fundamentally changed. The old weapons have failed. The new world is being born, not in some distant future, but right now, in this moment, as millions across Africa and beyond realize that sovereignty was never something to be granted, it was something to be taken. And Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier from Burkina Faso, has shown them how. The revolution will not be negotiated. It has already begun. End of complete script. 4,000 words. This story captures the moment when Africa chose dignity over dependency, when courage proved contagious, and when 9 words, Africa is done kneeling. Our sovereignty is not negotiable, changed the trajectory of global power forever. These events, unfolding over the past 3 weeks, mark not just a trade dispute, but the birth of a new world order where sovereignty is claimed, not requested,